The howling wind tearing through the pine trees in the dark night of Willow Creek was drowned out by a deafening explosion from the old apartment complex on the edge of town. Richard Evans, a 42-year-old firefighter with deep, memory-haunted eyes, stood in front of his wooden cabin, staring at the sky ablaze with red. For years he'd lived alone, his only companion the crackling fire in his hearth. But tonight, fate had other plans. Plans that would change everything. The piercing wail of the fire station's siren cut through the air, pulling him into a story that, 20 years later, he'd still recount with a choked, bittersweet smile. 2 decades later, beside a warm fireplace, Richard sat surrounded by 5 young women he'd pulled from that inferno. Sophie, Ella, Carol, Lily, and Bella. Bella, now a fierce 24-year-old, gripped his hand, her eyes shining bright. "Uncle Richard," she said, "family isn't where you're born. It's where you choose to love. You chose us, and we chose you." Richard looked at her, tears streaking down his weathered face. "I never thought I'd have a family like this," he whispered. "But you girls gave me everything." In that moment, he knew every sacrifice had been worth it. And it all began on that fateful night. Hey, everyone. This is a story about love rising above the flames, about a family forged in ashes. If you want to know how Richard saved those little girls and turned them into his own, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment. Who would you choose to love like family? Let's step into this journey together. That night, as Richard raced to the scene, what he saw was like a living nightmare. The fire roared like a wild beast, licking at the windows of the crumbling apartment building, black smoke swirling into the sky like death's own wings. Shattered glass mingled with desperate cries for help, echoing through the frigid air. "We've got to save everyone. Move!" Richard shouted to his crew, his voice raw and hoarse, cutting through the fire's roar. But deep in his chest, an old wound tore open. Over 20 years ago, when Richard was just a 15-year-old kid, flames had stolen his little sister, Emily, from their family's small home. He could still see her terrified eyes through the thick smoke, her screams swallowed by the collapsing wood. He'd rushed in to save her, but the heat and fumes had shoved him back, leaving him with empty hands and a scar on his soul that never healed. From that day, he'd sworn no one else would die in a fire. Not on his watch. Being a firefighter wasn't just a job. It was his redemption. Richard charged into the building, the heat slamming into his face like it wanted to melt his skin. The old wooden stairs groaned under his pounding boots, some steps already devoured by flames, leaving charred gaps in his path. "James, check the ground floor. I'm heading up," he yelled into his radio. James, his partner, nodded and split off, leaving Richard alone to face the sea of fire. By the time he reached the second floor, the smoke was so thick it stung his eyes, blurring his vision like he'd stepped into another world. He strained to hear over the fire's growl, and then faintly he caught it, the soft whimper of children crying. Instinct kicked in. He bolted toward the sound, kicking down a smoldering door. In a tiny room, 5 little girls huddled in the corner, their pale faces streaked with terror. Sophie, the oldest at about 10, clutched her sisters tightly, her red-rimmed eyes brimming with despair. Ella, 8, held Carol, 6, while Lily, 5, and Bella, the tiniest at 4, sobbed in their sister's arms. "Help us, mister," Sophie screamed, her voice trembling, but laced with a flicker of hope. Richard didn't hesitate. He dropped to his knees, scooping Bella and Lily into his arms. "Hold on to me tight. We're getting out now," he bellowed, his voice fighting the fire's roar. He gestured to Sophie, Ella, and Carol to follow. The stairs were gone now, swallowed by flames, burning chunks of wood raining down like fiery hail, blocking their escape. Richard led the girls down the hallway, searching for another way out. The smoke choked them. Bella clung to his neck, sobbing, "I'm scared." "Don't be afraid, I'm getting you out," Richard growled, his words both a comfort and a promise to himself. His breaths grew heavy, the smoke clawing at his lungs, but he couldn't stop. He wouldn't let these girls end up like Emily. Through the haze, a strange sound broke through, a soft, familiar voice that hit him like a punch to the gut. "Richard, save them." He froze, whipping around, but saw only the raging flames. It was Emily's voice, his little sister, gone all those years. He shook his head, chalking it up to a hallucination, but that voice felt like a jolt of strength, pushing him forward. He saw Emily's pleading eyes in his mind. And now 5 new pairs of eyes looked to him with the same desperate hope. At the end of the hall, he spotted a window, cracked but still shut tight. He set Bella and Lily down and smashed the glass with his elbow. It shattered with a sharp crack, jagged shards slicing into his arm, blood dripping onto the floor. He didn't feel the pain. Adrenaline drowned it out. All he could think was save them. He lifted Sophie through first, then Ella, Carol, Lily, and finally Bella. As the littlest one slipped out, a massive explosion rocked the building. The ceiling caved in, wood and bricks crashing down just behind him. Richard leapt through the window just as the hallway collapsed. Outside, the cool air hit his lungs, soothing the burning sting. He hit the ground hard, gasping, blood from his arm pooling on the grass. James rushed over, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Richard, you got the girls out, but their parents didn't make it." Richard turned, his heart sinking. The 5 girls clung to each other, sobbing amidst the wreckage. Sophie tried to stay strong, but her shoulders shook. Ella held Carol tight, both crying softly, while Lily and Bella gripped each other, wailing in terror. Richard's chest tightened. He thought of Emily, of the helplessness he'd felt losing her. He couldn't let these kids suffer more loss. James sighed. "We did what we could. They'll have to go to an orphanage now." Richard didn't answer right away. Emily's voice still echoed in his mind, like a call he couldn't ignore. He looked at the girls, a fierce sense of duty rising in him. "No," he muttered, then turned to James, his voice steady. "I won't let them be split up. I'll take care of them." James blinked, stunned. "Richard, are you crazy? You can't raise 5 kids on your own." Richard stood, blood still trickling from his arm, his eyes unwavering. "I don't know how, but I'll figure it out. They've lost everything. I won't let them lose each other." He walked over to the girls and knelt down. "You okay, kids?" Sophie looked up, her voice shaky. "Where are you taking us?" Richard smiled despite the uncertainty gnawing at him. "Home with me. We're going to be a family." He didn't know it then, but those words would launch him into a journey, one where the flames didn't just test him, but redefined what family truly means. The morning after the horrific fire, Willow Creek was cloaked in a heavy stillness. Ash from the smoldering ruins of the old apartment complex hung in the air, mingling with the acrid stench of burnt wood. The first rays of sunlight pierced through a thinning veil of smoke, casting a pale glow on the weary faces of townsfolk gathered around the scene. Somewhere, a mournful wail rose, blending with the fading sirens of ambulances, not rushing to save the living, but to carry away bodies forever silenced. Richard Evans sat alone on the wooden steps of the fire station, his slashed hands trembling as they cradled his head. His bloodshot eyes weren't red from smoke, but from a sleepless night, his mind torn apart by images he couldn't shake. He saw the 5 little girls clinging to each other amidst the ashes, Sophie's gaze, both fierce and broken, as she watched over her sisters. He heard Bella, the tiniest, screaming for her mother in a blind panic. And above all, he couldn't erase the moment when the charred remains of their parents were dragged from the wreckage, their lifeless eyes staring into a grey, unforgiving sky. Over and over, the same question gnawed at him. If I'd gotten there sooner, if I'd been just a little faster, would they still be alive? It was a sharp blade twisting in his chest, dragging up memories of Emily, his little sister, the one he couldn't save all those years ago. His hands that had pulled countless lives from the flames, felt useless now, powerless against losses he couldn't undo. James, his fellow firefighter, walked over and sat beside him. A seasoned veteran, James's face was etched with lines from years of facing danger. "Richard, you did everything you could," he said, his voice low but earnest. "No one could have done better in that mess." Richard shook his head, his voice thick with emotion. "But I didn't save their parents, James. Those kids have nothing left." James sighed, resting a hand on his shoulder. "I know, but we can't change it. The girls will head to the big city orphanage now. They'll take care of them." Richard closed his eyes, picturing Sophie, Ella, Carol, Lily and Bella torn apart, shipped off to strange places with no one to hold on to. He thought of Emily, of the helplessness that had crushed him when he lost her, and his heart clenched. "No," he whispered, then shot to his feet, his voice firm. "I won't let them be split up. I'm taking them in." James stared, dumbfounded, as if he hadn't heard right. "Richard, are you serious? You're a single firefighter with no parenting experience. How are you going to raise 5 kids? Richard turned to him, his eyes blazing with fierce resolve. "I don't know, James, but I'll learn. They've lost their family. I can't let them lose each other too. I owe them that." James shook his head, but said nothing more. He knew Richard. Once his mind was set, no one could sway him. Just then, a large van from the orphanage rumbled up, kicking up dust as it stopped in front of the station. Margaret, the orphanage director, stepped out with a stern air. She was an older woman, her hair streaked with silver, her face hardened but her eyes sharp. She fixed Richard with a look and said, "We're here to take the girls. This is procedure, Richard. You can't fight it." Richard stepped forward, planting himself in her path, his voice steely. "No, I'm keeping them. I won't let them be torn apart." Margaret raised an eyebrow, her tone icy. "You? A lone firefighter? You think you can raise 5 orphaned girls? You don't have the time or the know-how." Richard clenched his jaw, his fists tightening until the cuts on his hands bled again. "I don't have experience, but I've got heart. I'll do whatever it takes to keep them together. They've suffered enough." Margaret studied him for a long moment, her gaze flickering between doubt and surprise. She sighed. "If you're that determined, I can't stop you. But I'll be watching closely. If you can't handle it, they're coming to the orphanage. This isn't a game, Richard." Richard nodded, a mix of relief and dread settling over him. He turned back to the station's waiting room, where the 5 girls sat. Sophie held Bella tight, soothing the littlest one as she whimpered. Ella and Carol pressed close together, their eyes swollen from crying, while Lily gripped Sophie's hand, staring into nothing. Richard knelt before them, his voice soft but steady. "From now on, I'm taking care of you. I promise you won't be split up." Sophie looked up, her teary eyes sparking with hope. "For real? We won't have to leave each other." Richard rested a hand on her shoulder and smiled. "I promise, Sophie. We're a family now." That afternoon, Richard brought the 5 girls to his wooden cabin. The old door creaked as it swung open, and an awkward tension hung between them. The small house, built for a solitary man, now had to welcome 5 strangers. Sophie stepped in first, guiding her sisters, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar space. Bella clung to Sophie's hand, her voice trembling. "Mister, you won't leave us, will you?" Richard knelt down, ruffling her hair. "Never, Bella. I'm here with you, always." As the girls settled onto the worn sofa in the living room, Richard rummaged through the pile of belongings he'd salvaged from the fire. Among the debris, he found a small scorched box buried in the ashes. He pried it open, revealing a folded scrap of paper, the handwriting shaky, scrawled in desperation. "Please keep my children together. Don't let them be separated. A mother. No name, but Richard knew instantly it was the final plea of the girl's mum, written in her last moments. He gripped the note, his heart seizing. It wasn't just a dying wish. It was a call, a responsibility laid on his shoulders. He looked at the 5 girls, feeling fate tie him to them. "I'll keep that promise," he whispered to himself, his voice quivering. But deep down, he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. He wasn't just facing the challenge of raising 5 kids. He'd have to battle his own fears and doubts. That night, after the girls drifted off to sleep on makeshift beds of blankets in the living room, Richard stood on the porch, staring up at a star-filled sky. A cold wind swept through, carrying the faint scent of ash from the fire. He clutched the note in his hand, and in that moment he heard Emily's voice on the breeze. "Richard, you did the right thing." He startled, spinning around, but there was only darkness and the rustle of leaves. A sad smile tugged at his lips. Though Emily was gone, he knew she was watching, and now he had 5 reasons to keep living, to keep fighting. The old wooden door creaked as Richard Evans pushed it open, the fading afternoon sunlight slipping through cracks in the walls, spilling onto the dusty floor. His small house in Willow Creek, where he'd lived alone for years, suddenly felt cramped and unfamiliar as 5 little girls stepped inside. Sophie, Ella, Carol, Lily, and Bella hesitated at the threshold, their eyes darting around. The space, once filled only with the crackle of the fireplace and the whistle of wind through the gaps, now echoed with the soft patter of tiny feet and the hushed whispers of children who'd just lost their entire world. Richard watched them, his chest heavy. He'd never imagined this house, once a home he'd shared with his sister Emily before the fire took her, would hear children's laughter again. After Emily's death, he'd turned it into an empty shell, a place to exist, not live. No decorations, no warmth, just a few worn-out belongings and a quiet sorrow. But now, with these 5 girls, he knew things had to change. "This is your home now," Richard said, keeping his voice gentle to ease the fear in their eyes. He pointed to the old sofa in the living room. "Go sit there, kids. I'll grab some blankets and pillows." Sophie, the oldest, nodded and led her sisters to the sofa. Bella clung to her hand, her big teary eyes scanning Richard. "Mister, there aren't any ghosts here, right?" Her voice trembled, as if she feared the shadows in the house might swallow her whole. Richard knelt in front of her, forcing a smile. "No ghosts, Bella. I'm here with you, and nothing's going to scare you anymore." But as he spoke, a chill ran down his spine. He thought of Emily, of the nights he'd sworn he heard her laughter in the corners, though he knew it was just the delusions of a lonely man. He stood and climbed the creaky stairs to the attic to fetch blankets. As he dragged out an old trunk, a tattered doll tumbled to the floor, its cloudy glass eyes staring up at him. It was Emily's doll, a painful keepsake he'd held onto. His hands shook as he picked it up, then quickly tucked it into a corner. He didn't want the girls to see it. But when he turned back to the living room, Bella was there, her curious gaze fixed on the attic. "What were you holding?" she asked, her innocent voice tinged with suspicion. Richard flinched, scrambling for an answer. "Just some old stuff. I put it back up there. Come on, let's head downstairs." He guided her back to her sisters, but her eyes lingered on the attic, as if she sensed something he wasn't ready to face. That first night in their new home passed in a heavy silence. Richard spread blankets on the living room floor for the girls since he didn't have enough beds. Sophie leaned against the sofa, cradling Bella, while Ella, Carol, and Lily curled up beside her. He stood in the kitchen doorway, watching them, a mix of warmth and unease swelling inside him. He'd never been a father, never even considered caring for anyone but himself. Now these 5 girls were his responsibility, a burden he'd chosen, but one he had no idea how to carry. He decided to cook their first dinner. In the kitchen, he fumbled through the cabinets, finding some pasta and a can of tomato sauce. But it quickly turned into a disaster. The pot boiled over, the pasta fused to the bottom in a charred mess, and smoke billowed up. "Damn it," Richard muttered, shutting off the stove, but a small flame flared from a pan of oil he'd forgotten. Panicked, he grabbed a towel to smother it, but the smoke spread, filling the house with a sharp, burnt stench. Sophie rose from the sofa and stepped into the kitchen, her tired eyes sharp with resolve. "Mister, let me help," she said, her voice quiet but steady. Richard turned, sweat beading on his forehead. "You know how to cook, Sophie?" She nodded, a flicker of sadness in her gaze. "My mum taught me before." Her voice caught, but she steadied herself and moved to the stove. Her small frame worked with surprising skill, turning off the burner, tossing the ruined pasta, and starting over. Richard stepped aside, watching her, his heart twisting. Sophie wasn't just a kid. She'd become her sister's anchor since their parents died. A role far too big for a 10-year-old. Soon the warm scent of pasta with tomato sauce filled the house. Sophie set plates on the table and called out, "Ella, Carol, Lily, Bella, come eat." The girls shuffled over hesitantly, settling around the rickety wooden table. Richard watched, a mix of pride and shame washing over him. He hadn't done much for them yet, but they were already looking out for each other. As they started eating, the front door swung open with a bang. Victor, Richard's gruff neighbor, stormed in. An older man with silver hair and a perpetual scowl, his raspy voice cut through the room. He scanned the scene, 5 girls eating, then fixed Richard with a glare. "You really think you can handle 5 kids, Richard? You're a firefighter, not a parent. This is the dumbest idea I've ever seen." Richard stood, his gaze calm but firm. "I know I'm not perfect, Victor, but I'll try my best. These girls deserve love and to stay together." Victor snorted. "You're a dreamer, Richard. You won't last." He turned and left, leaving a tense silence in his wake. Richard didn't reply, but he knew this wouldn't be the last time he'd faced doubt. From others and himself. That night, after the girls fell asleep, Richard sat alone by the fireplace, the flickering flames dancing across his face. He thought of Victor's words, his own clumsiness, and the note he'd found in the ashes, the mother's plea to keep her children together. Could he really keep that promise? A soft noise broke his thoughts. He turned to see Bella standing there, clutching the tattered doll, Emily's doll he'd hidden in the attic. "Bella, why aren't you sleeping?" he asked, worry creeping into his voice. She looked up at him, her clear eyes glinting with something strange. "I found it on the floor. Is it hers?" She pointed to the attic. "She told me you're a good person." Richard froze, stepping closer. "Who? What are you talking about?" Bella smiled innocently. "The girl in the white dress, standing in the corner. She said you'd protect us." With that, she padded back to her spot, leaving Richard stunned. He stared at the attic, his heart pounding. Was it Emily? Or just a child's imagination warped by grief? He didn't know, but in that moment, the house didn't feel so cold anymore. It was coming alive, thanks to the girls he'd brought home, and maybe, just maybe, Emily's unseen presence. The first few days in the wooden house in Willow Creek swept over Richard Evans like a small storm, hurling him into a whirlwind of challenges he'd never imagined. Once a firefighter accustomed to battling flames and smoke, he now had to navigate tears, innocent questions, and the heavy silence of 5 little girls who'd just lost their parents. Sophie, Ella, Carol, Lily, and Bella breathed new life into the house, but they also brought a tide of insecurities Richard didn't know how to calm. That first morning, Richard woke early, determined to kick off the day with a decent breakfast for the girls. He rummaged through the kitchen, finding a few eggs and a stale loaf of bread. "Keep it simple," he told himself, hoping he could manage a meal without repeating the last disaster. But chaos struck fast. The eggs splattered in the pan, scorching into a blackened mess, while smoke poured from the oven where he'd forgotten the bread. His coughing echoed over the clatter of pots and pans, the sharp stench of burnt food flooding the house. Ella, the 8-year-old with tangled hair, shuffled into the kitchen and crossed her arms. "Don't you know how to cook?" she asked, her tone a mix of curiosity and bluntness. "My mum made eggs way better." Richard turned, sweat dripping down his forehead, forcing a weak smile. "I'm learning, Ella. I'll do better next time, okay?" But her words cut deep. He knew he couldn't replace their mother, and every little failure like this made him feel more helpless. Sophie stepped in moments later, swiftly turning off the stove and tackling the mess. "I'll handle it, mister," she said, her voice calm but her eyes tinged with sorrow. Richard stepped aside, watching her move with a skill beyond her years, his heart sinking. At just 10, this girl had taken on too much, and he wondered if he could ever lighten her load. Breakfast eventually made it to the table, slightly charred bread and lumpy fried eggs, but the girls didn't complain. They ate in silence, their eyes occasionally flicking to Richard, searching for something, maybe comfort he didn't yet know how to give. He sat with them, trying to spark conversation. "What do you want to do today? I could take you out to the yard to play." But all he got were faint nods and a lingering quiet. The struggles didn't end with cooking. Each day Richard realized raising 5 girls wasn't just about food and shelter. It was facing wounds he didn't know how to heal. One afternoon, as he washed dishes in the kitchen, a furious shout erupted from the living room. He rushed in to find Carol and Ella tugging at the tattered doll, the one that belonged to Emily, the one Bella had found. "It's mine," Carol yelled, her face flushed with anger, clutching the doll tightly. "You haven't played with it all week. Why can't I have it?" Ella snapped back, just as fierce. Richard stepped in, trying to mediate. "Hey, come on you two, calm down. We can share it, right?" But they ignored him, their argument escalating until Carol burst into tears and bolted to a corner, hugging the doll to her chest. Richard stood there, frozen, clueless about how to fix it. He'd never dealt with petty squabbles like this, and every misstep chipped away at his confidence. That night, after the girls were asleep, Richard slumped by the fireplace, his head in his hands. He thought of his promise. To the girls, to the mother who'd scrawled that note in the ashes, and wondered if he had the strength to keep it. The house was no longer silent, but the children's laughter he'd hoped for was drowned out by tears and pained silences. The front door suddenly swung open, and Victor stormed in, his usual gruffness on full display. He glanced around, eyeing the pile of dirty dishes and scattered toys on the floor. "I told you, Richard," he said, his raspy voice dripping with mockery. "You can't do this. Send those kids to the orphanage and quit trying." Richard looked up, exhausted but unshaken. "I promised them, Victor. I'm not giving up." Victor smirked. "Promises are easy to make. Look at you. You can't cook, can't calm them down, can't even keep this place clean. It takes more than love to raise kids, Richard." Richard paused, then spoke slowly. "You're right. I don't have experience, but I can't let them lose each other. If I give up, I'll never forgive myself." Victor stared at him, his gaze softening for a split second, but he said nothing more and walked out. Richard sighed, knowing Victor's doubts weren't baseless. What he didn't expect was that the real test was still lurking ahead. The next morning, a sleek black car rolled up to the house. A middle-aged man stepped out, dressed in an expensive suit, his face cold and his eyes sharp as knives. He knocked, and when Richard opened the door, the man introduced himself. "I'm Harold Grayson, owner of the burned apartment complex. I'm here about the kids." Richard frowned. "What about them?" Harold gave a thin smile. "You think you can just keep them? I've heard you're taking them in, but I don't approve. They're my responsibility, and I'm sending them where they belong. The orphanage." Richard's fists clenched, his voice hard. They don't belong to you. I saved them, and I'm keeping them. Harold's lip curled. Saved them? You're just an arrogant fool, Richard. I could sue you for interfering with my rights. That complex was my property, and those kids are my problem to handle. You don't know what you're tangled up in. Richard stepped forward, blocking the doorway. Sue me if you want. I'm not handing them over. They're my family now. Harold studied him for a moment, then turned back to his car, tossing a final threat over his shoulder. You'll regret this, Richard. I don't let things go. As the car disappeared, a chill crawled up Richard's spine. He didn't know who Harold was, but instinct screamed that this man was more than just a wealthy landlord. That night, as Richard checked on the girls before bed, he found Sophie sitting alone in a corner, her gaze distant. "Sophie, you okay?" he asked, kneeling beside her. She hesitated, then whispered, "I keep thinking about that night. The fire." Mum yelled, "Don't let him find us. I don't know who he was, but I'm scared." Her voice trembled, her eyes clouded with doubt. Richard froze, Harold's face flashing in his mind. He rested a hand on her shoulder, his tone soft but firm. "Don't be afraid, Sophie. I'll protect you, I promise." But inside, a question swelled. Was that fire really an accident? And what is Harold Grayson hiding? The days in the wooden house in Willow Creek were no longer the chaotic blur of the beginning, but they were far from peaceful. Richard Evans, a man once at home battling flames, was now learning to extinguish the emotional storms of 5 little girls who'd lost their parents. Sophie, Ella, Carol, Lily, and Bella had become an inseparable part of his life. But each day brought a fresh challenge, forcing him to confront his own limits. That morning, Richard jolted awake to a piercing cry from the living room. He stumbled out, still in rumpled pajamas, and found Bella curled up in a corner, clutching Emily's tattered doll. Sophie knelt beside her, trying to soothe her, but the 10-year-old's face was etched with worry. "What's wrong?" Richard asked, his voice rough from sleep. Sophie looked up, her eyes weary. "Bella's scared of the dark. Every night, Mum would sit with her until she fell asleep. I don't know how to make her stop being afraid." Richard dropped to his knees beside Bella, his heart sinking. The littlest girl, just 4, gazed at him with teary, pleading eyes. "I want Mummy." Her voice quivered, small but sharp enough to tear him apart. He thought of Emily, of the nights he'd sat by her side to chase away her fears, and now he felt lost, unsure how to fill the void of a mother's love. "I'm here, Bella," he said softly, rubbing her back. "You don't have to be scared anymore." He scooped her into his arms, holding her close, and started humming a lullaby his own mother once sang to Emily. His voice was rough, off-key and raspy, but Bella's sobs slowly faded, her eyes fluttering shut in his embrace. Sophie watched, a flicker of relief in her gaze. But Richard knew his song couldn't erase their pain. It was just a flimsy patch on a still bleeding wound. In the days that followed, Richard poured everything into building a real family. He bought second-hand beds from a shop in town, turning a corner of the living room into a sleeping nook for the girls. He cracked open old cookbooks from the cupboard, attempting meals that still ended up charred or bland. The girls didn't complain, they ate quietly, and sometimes Sophie stepped in to help, a silent big sister carrying more than her share. But not everything went smoothly. One afternoon, as Richard mopped the kitchen floor, a furious argument erupted from the backyard. He rushed out to find Ella and Carol wrestling over a small bucket. "It's mine!" Carol shouted, her face red with fury. "I grabbed it first," Ella shot back, refusing to back down. Richard stepped in, trying to mediate. "Hey, come on, you two. We can share, right?" But they ignored him, their fight escalating until Ella hurled the bucket to the ground and stormed inside, sobbing. Richard stood there, helpless, unsure how to bridge the gap. He'd never faced these petty squabbles before, and each failure gnawed at his belief in the promise he'd made. He followed Ella inside and found her curled up in a corner, hugging her knees. "Ella, I'm sorry," he said, sitting beside her. "I don't know how to make things better." She looked up, eyes swollen. "You're not my mom. You don't get it." Her words stabbed, but Richard didn't flinch. She was right. He couldn't replace their parents, and he was fumbling through something he'd never prepared for. That night, with the girls asleep, Richard sat by the fireplace, clutching the scorched note he'd found in the ashes. The mother's trembling words, "Please keep my children together," echoed in his mind like a relentless reminder. He wondered if he was failing, if he could keep that promise when he couldn't even ease their hurt. The front door creaked open, and Victor stepped in, bringing a gust of cold air. He surveyed the mess, toys and blankets strewn across the floor. "I told you, Richard," he rasped. "You can't do this. Send the kids away. Stop torturing yourself." Richard looked up, tired but resolute. "I'm not giving up, Victor. I promised them." Victor sank into the chair across from him, sighing. You're stubborn as hell, but you need help, Richard. You can't do it all alone." Richard blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected offer. "You'd help?" Victor nodded, his gaze softening slightly. "I'm no good at cooking or calming kids, but I can fix things. This house needs work to fit those girls. Call me if you need me." He stood and left before Richard could thank him. Victor's words sparked a faint glimmer of hope. Maybe Richard wasn't as alone as he'd thought. But that hope was quickly tested when Harold Grayson returned the next morning. This time, he brought another man in a suit, carrying a thick stack of papers. "Richard," Harold said, his voice icy, "I've filed a lawsuit. You've got no legal right to those kids. They belong in the orphanage, and I'll make sure they go." Richard planted himself in the doorway, fists clenched. "You don't get to decide their lives. I saved them, and I won't let you tear them apart." Harold smirked. "Saved them? You're just a fool playing hero. I've got proof you're unfit to care for them. The courts will side with me." Richard stepped closer, his voice a low growl. "Sue me all you want. I'll fight to the end. These girls are my family. You're not taking them." Harold stared him down, then turned away, tossing a parting threat. "You'll lose, Richard. And when you do, you'll lose everything." As he drove off, Sophie emerged from the living room, her eyes wide with worry. "Who was that, mister?" she asked. Richard knelt, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry, Sophie. I won't let him hurt us." But inside, his suspicions about Harold grew. He recalled Sophie's words from before, "Don't let him find us," and wondered if Harold was tied to the fire. That night, with the girls asleep, Richard sat by the window, staring into the darkness. A faint whisper drifted from the corner. He turned to see Bella murmuring to Emily's doll. "She says you'll win, right?" Bella said, smiling innocently. Richard's blood ran cold as he approached. "Bella, what are you saying?" She looked up, her eyes bright. "The girl in the white dress told me. She said you're good, and we'll stay here." With that, she hugged the doll and drifted off. Richard stood frozen, his heart pounding. Was it Bella's imagination or Emily's presence? He couldn't tell, but in that moment he felt an unseen strength bolstering him. He wouldn't give up, not just for the girls, but for himself and the promise he'd made. Time trickled by in the wooden house in Willow Creek, like slow drips from the eaves, quiet yet heavy. Richard Evans was growing used to the new rhythm of life with the 5 girls, Sophie, Ella, Carol, Lily, and Bella, but each day still threw unexpected challenges his way. The fire had stolen their parents, leaving deep scars in their hearts, and Richard, despite his best efforts, felt like a clumsy craftsman, fumbling to mend wounds he didn't know how to heal. One early morning, pale sunlight filtered through the window, dusting the worn floorboards. Richard was brewing coffee in the kitchen when a sharp cry rang out from the backyard. He bolted outside, finding Carol standing amid the overgrown grass, her face flushed with fury. Ella stood before her, clutching a tattered little notebook. "Where'd you hide it?" Carol yelled, her voice trembling. "I need it for homework, or the teacher'll punish me." Ella shrugged, her tone icy. "I didn't hide it. You lost it, and now you're blaming me, huh?" Their argument spiraled, their shouts piercing the still morning air. Richard stepped in, trying to calm them. "Hey, you two, let's relax. We'll find the notebook, okay?" But Carol spun toward him, tears brimming in her eyes. "You can't help. You're not my dad." With that, she stormed inside, leaving Richard stunned in the yard. Her words sliced into him, a stark reminder that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't fill the void left by the ones they'd lost. He turned to Ella, noticing her shoulders trembling as she stared at the ground. "Ella, what's going on?" he asked gently. She looked up, her eyes red. "I didn't hide Carol's notebook. I just want things to be like they were." Her voice broke, and Richard knew that before she meant wasn't their days here. It was the time with their parents, when life was still whole. With a sigh, he guided Ella back inside. He found Carol curled up in the living room corner, clutching the notebook that Lily, the gentle 5-year-old, had quietly brought over. Lily stood nearby, her eyes anxious. "I found it under the sofa. I didn't want them to fight." Richard gave her a grateful smile, thanking her, but his heart weighed heavy. Each girl carried her own pain, and he couldn't heal them all at once. The struggles didn't stay confined to the house. When Richard first took the girls to the local school, he'd hoped it'd be a fresh start. But as they stepped into the classroom, curious stares and whispers swarmed them. "Look, the orphans?" a bigger boy sneered. "No parents. Bet no one loves them." Ella, usually tough and defiant, froze, her face burning red. She clenched her fists, fighting tears, then turned and walked away. That afternoon, when Richard picked them up, Ella stayed silent, bolting to her room and locking the door as soon as they got home. He knocked, worry lacing his voice. "Ella, come eat dinner with me, sweetheart." No answer, just faint sobs from inside. He kept knocking, his tone growing urgent. "Ella, I know you're upset, but you can't shut yourself away forever. I'm here." Finally, the door cracked open, and Ella threw herself into his arms, sobbing. "I don't want to go back. They said no one loves me." Richard held her tight, his chest aching. "You've got me, your sisters. We're a family, Ella. Don't let their words hurt you." But he knew his reassurance fell short. The girls needed more than his clumsy attempts at fatherhood. They needed a way to release their pain. That night, as Richard cleaned the kitchen after dinner, Sophie approached, her face etched with exhaustion. At 10, always the big sister, she now looked like an adult, worn thin. "Uncle Richard," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "I don't know if I can keep going. I'm so tired." He turned, meeting her sad eyes, and rested a hand on her shoulder. "Sophie, you've done too much already. You don't have to carry it all. I'm here." But she shook her head, tears spilling. "I have to be strong for them, but I just want to cry." Richard pulled her close, and for the first time, she broke down in his arms, sobbing uncontrollably. He held her, feeling her pain as if it were his own. "You can cry, Sophie," he said, his voice thick. "You don't have to be strong alone. We'll get through this together." In that moment, the weight on his shoulders felt heavier than ever. But he knew he couldn't give up. Not when they needed him most. The next morning, Victor showed up at the door, lugging an old wooden toolbox. "You said the house needs fixing, right?" He grunted, his tone lacking its usual bite. "I'm here to help." Richard smiled, a spark of warmth flickering inside. "Thanks, Victor, it really does." They got to work, Victor patching up a wobbly window frame while Richard cleared out junk from a corner. Mid-task, Victor spoke up unexpectedly. "You know, I had a son once." Richard paused, surprised. "You never mentioned that?" Victor nodded, his gaze distant. He died in an accident. My wife couldn't take the loss and passed soon after. Been alone since. Losing a kid's the worst pain there is, Richard, but you're fighting so these girls don't have to feel that. I respect you for it." Richard went quiet, managing only a thank you. He hadn't expected Victor, the man who doubted him, to carry such a heavy past. From then on, Victor became part of their lives, quietly helping by fixing things, dropping off garden veggies, and sometimes telling the girls stories. One evening, as Richard sat by the fireplace, Sophie approached, holding a small scrap of paper. "I found this in Mom's old coat pocket," she said, handing it to him. It was a hastily scribbled note. "If anything happens, protect my children. Don't let him take them." Richard's blood ran cold, Harold Grayson's threats flashing in his mind. He looked at Sophie. "Do you know who he is?" She shook her head. "I'm not sure, but Mum was terrified. I think the fire wasn't an accident." Her words hit like lightning, igniting the suspicions simmering in Richard's gut. He hugged her, his voice firm. "I'll find the truth, Sophie. I promise." That night, with the girls asleep, Richard stood by the window clutching the note. A new resolve surged within him, not just to protect the girls, but to uncover the mystery behind the fire that had changed everything. 20 years slipped by in the wooden house in Willow Creek like a fleeting blink. Yet time had carved its mark into every weathered wall and garden branch. Richard Evans, now 62, his hair streaked with silver and his face lined with wrinkles, stood gazing out through a dusty window. The house, once a cold shell echoing only with the wind through its cracks, now brimmed with laughter, memories, and the stories of the 5 girls he'd pulled from the ashes of a tragedy. Sophie, Ella, Carol, Lily, and Bella were no longer the frightened children huddled in corners, weeping for what they'd lost. They'd grown into remarkable women, each shaped by the hardships they'd faced alongside Richard, carrying dreams and strengths of their own. Sophie, the steadfast eldest, had become a young psychologist, dedicating her life to helping others heal from losses like hers. Ella, once a stubborn firecracker, was now a gifted artist, splashing colors onto canvases to tell the stories she couldn't voice. Carol, the quiet one, excelled as a med student, driven to become a doctor and save the lives she couldn't hold on to as a child. Lily, with her gentle heart, found her passion in interior design, turning cold spaces into warm homes, and Bella, the tiny girl who'd feared the dark, had grown into a fierce 24-year-old animal rights activist, bold and full of fire. Richard watched his daughters, not bound by blood, but by love and sacrifice, with a quiet, unspoken pride. Their life together hadn't been easy, but the bond they'd forged had carried them through every storm. The wooden house was no longer just a shelter. It was a symbol of family, every corner bearing the imprint of their shared journey. But time didn't bring only joy. Lately, Richard had felt his body falter. Exhaustion clung to him like a shadow, and sharp pain stabbed his chest whenever he pushed too hard. He hid it, unwilling to burden his girls, but Sophie, with her psychologist's keen eye, had noticed something was off. One evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, a rare treat amid the girls' busy lives, Sophie broke the silence. "Uncle Richard," she said, her voice low but piercing, "you haven't been well lately, have you? I can see you're more tired than usual." Richard paused, his spoon hovering mid-air. He flashed a casual smile. "Just old age, Sophie. I'm fine, don't worry." But a flicker of unease crossed his eyes, and Sophie wasn't fooled. "Don't hide it," she pressed, her voice trembling. "I know you've always pushed yourself for us, but now it's our turn to take care of you." The others, Ella, Carol, Lily, and Bella, turned to him, their gazes a mix of concern and quiet fear. Richard sighed, realizing he couldn't keep it up forever. "All right," he said, his tone softening. "I'll see a doctor, but don't worry, I'm still tough." The next day, Sophie dragged him to the local hospital. In the exam room, the doctor's face grew grave as he checked Richard over. After a battery of tests, he called them in, his voice steady but somber. "Mr. Evans, you have a serious heart condition. Your heart's weakening, and you need surgery immediately. Without it, your life's at risk." Richard sat still, his mind blank. He wasn't afraid for himself, he feared for his girls. He'd promised to protect them, to be there forever, but now he was the one who needed saving. Sophie gripped his hand, her voice breaking. "You'll do the surgery, right? We can't lose you." He met her eyes and nodded. "I will. I'm not leaving you girls." But deep down, dread gnawed at him, not of death, but of his daughters facing yet another loss, like the night fire stole their parents. On the drive home, Richard stayed quiet, clutching the scorched note he'd found in their mother's coat years ago. Don't let him take them. He'd suspected Harold Grayson all along but never found proof. Now, staring down mortality, he felt an urgent need to uncover the truth, not just for their safety, but to fulfill the promise to the mother who died. Back at the house, Ella, Carol, Lily, and Bella waited by the door. Sophie explained everything, and the room grew thick with tension. Bella, now a fierce young woman, rushed to Richard, throwing her arms around him as sobs shook her. "You can't leave us, Uncle Richard. You're our only family." Richard hugged her back, tears streaking his weathered face. "I'll fight with everything I've got, Bella, I promise." But he knew this promise wasn't fully his to keep. It hinged on the surgery and on fate. That night, with the girls in their rooms, Richard sat alone by the fireplace, watching the flames dance. He thought of Emily, his little sister, and for the first time in years he whispered, "Emily, if you're out there, help me through this. The girls need me." A breeze slipped through the window, carrying a faint sound like Emily's distant laughter. He smiled, a small comfort settling in his chest. The next day, Sophie approached him with a stack of old papers she'd dug up from the city library. "I looked into Harold Grayson," she said, her voice resolute. "He owned the burned complex, and records show he cut safety costs to boost profits. I think he might have caused the fire on purpose." Richard's blood ran cold as he gripped the documents. "You're sure, Sophie?" She nodded. "No direct proof yet, but it all points to him. I want you to get better. Then we'll bring him down together." Richard looked at her, pride swelling in his chest. The girl who'd once cowered in a corner had grown into a fierce woman ready to fight for their family. "All right," he said firmly. "I'll get through the surgery, and we'll find the truth together." The night before the operation, Richard lay in bed, moonlight spilling through the window onto his face. He closed his eyes, and in a hazy dream Emily appeared, wearing her old white dress, smiling. "You've done well, Richard. Don't be afraid." He jolted awake, heart pounding, but the fear was gone. He knew he had to live, not just for his girls, but to finish the mission fate had handed him. The day of Richard Evans's surgery loomed closer, and the air in the wooden house in Willow Creek grew heavier than ever. The rare bursts of laughter that once bounced off the walls gave way to a taut silence, laced with the anxious whispers of the 5 women he'd raised for 20 years. Sophie, Ella, Carol, Lily, and Bella were grown now, but in this moment they seemed to shrink back into the scared little girls who'd huddled in corners, facing the terror of losing a loved one all over again. That morning, faint sunlight filtered through the pine trees, spilling onto the dusty floor. Sophie, ever the steadfast eldest, stood in the living room, her voice firm, but her eyes betraying her fear. "We need to get everything ready for Uncle Richard. Carol, pack his things. Ella, tidy up so the house is set when he comes back. Lily and Bella, stay with him as much as you can. We've got to keep our spirits up. For him." The girls nodded, each diving into their tasks, but no one spoke further. They knew this surgery wasn't just a medical hurdle, it was a battle of wills. Once again, they were staring down the possibility of losing the most important person in their lives. Richard lay on the sofa, trying to seem calm despite his pale face and labored breaths. He looked at his daughters and managed a weak smile. "Why are you all so tense? I'm just taking a little break, that's all." But his voice was thinner than usual, and Bella, now 24 but still his baby girl, couldn't hold back her tears. She rushed to him, grabbing his hand. "You have to promise us you'll get better. We need you, Uncle Richard." Richard stroked her hair, his heart twisting. "I promise I'll try my hardest, Bella. You girls are my everything." But he knew this promise wasn't entirely his to keep. It rested in the hands of the surgeons and the whims of fate. At the hospital, the sterile chill of the white hallways gripped their hearts. Richard was wheeled into a prep room, hooked up to IVs and a heart monitor. The steady beep-beep rang out, a fragile reminder of life's thin thread. The girls gathered around him, struggling to stay composed, but Lily's trembling hands gave them away. The doctor entered, his tone low but clear. "We're taking Mr. Evans into surgery now. It'll take a few hours. Please wait outside." Sophie nodded, but as they started to wheel him away, she darted forward, seizing his hand. "You have to come back to us, Uncle Richard. We lost Mum and Dad once. I can't lose you too." Richard squeezed her hand, his eyes shining with love. "I'll be back, Sophie. I won't leave you girls alone." He smiled, but inside fear simmered. He thought of Emily, his little sister, and wondered if he'd make it through this time. The girls stood in the hallway as the operating room doors swung shut. The clatter of nurses' footsteps mingled with the pounding of their own hearts. Sophie sank into a chair, clutching the documents about Harold Grayson she'd uncovered. She whispered to Ella, "If he pulls through, we'll bring that man down. I know the fire wasn't an accident." Ella nodded, her voice thick. "He's got to live to see that day, Sophie. He deserves the truth." Carol, with her medical know-how, sat beside Lily, explaining the surgery step by step to calm her, though her own hands shook. Bella hugged Emily's tattered doll, the keepsake she'd clung to since childhood, murmuring, "Please, help him." Time crawled by, each minute stretching into an eternity. The girls sat still, eyes locked on the doors, hands clasped as if passing strength between them. After over 5 grueling hours, the doctor emerged, his face weary but lit with a faint smile. "The surgery was a success. Mr. Evans is stable, but he'll need a long recovery. We're keeping him here for monitoring." A collective sigh of relief broke the silence, tears streaming down their faces. Sophie hugged Ella tight, Carol gripped Lily's hand, and Bella sobbed, he did it." They rushed to the recovery room, finding Richard on the bed, eyes closed but breathing steady. Sophie knelt beside him, whispering, "You kept your promise, Uncle Richard." In the weeks that followed, Richard stayed in the hospital to heal. His daughters took turns caring for him, never straying far. Sophie handled his meds and talked to the doctors, keeping a steady front for her sisters. Ella, with her fiery spirit, shared funny childhood tales to make him laugh, though her voice sometimes cracked. Carol assisted the nurses with her medical skills, checking his vitals. Lily and Bella stayed closest, bringing garden flowers to brighten the stark room, turning it into a slice of home. One day, Richard woke from a long nap, sunlight streaming through the window onto his face. He looked around, seeing his 5 girls by his bedside, each unique, yet all radiating love. "Sophie, Ella, Carol, Lily, Bella," he rasped, his voice rough but warm. "You've grown up so much. I don't know how to thank you. Without you, I wouldn't have made it." Sophie took his hand, tears falling. "We're the ones who should thank you. You gave your whole life to love and raise us. Now it's our turn to take care of you." Richard smiled, feeling the strength of their family bond like never before. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with his girls beside him, he was ready for anything. That night, with the girls back home, Richard lay in his hospital bed, gazing at the star-filled sky through the window. He whispered, "Emily, you see, I made it." A soft breeze slipped in, carrying a faint echo of Emily's laughter, as if assuring him he wasn't alone. But then, in a drowsy haze, he heard another voice, Sophie's, distant yet clear. "We're not done yet, Uncle. Harold Grayson will pay." Richard jolted awake, eyes wide. The surgery was just a small victory. The real fight, uncovering the truth about the fire and shielding his girls from a shadow of the past, still loomed ahead. Hey, dear friends, we've just walked through an emotional roller coaster with Richard and his 5 girls. Sophie, Ella, Carol, Lily, and Bella. From that fateful fire to a heartwarming lantern release in Willow Creek. But the story's not over yet. Harold Grayson still lurks in the shadows, hiding secrets about that blaze from years ago. Will Richard and his daughters bring him to justice? How will truth prevail? It's all coming in the next chapters, and you won't want to miss it. In the days following the surgery, the wooden house in Willow Creek settled back into a slow rhythm. But it carried a fresh breath of life. Richard Evans, having survived the brink, returned home after a long hospital stay. He sat in his weathered armchair by the fireplace, eyes half closed, listening to the wind rustle through the pine trees outside. His heart was still frail, each beat a quiet reminder of life's fragility, but fear no longer gripped him. Beside him were his 5 girls, Sophie, Ella, Carol, Lily, and Bella, the ones who'd transformed his solitary existence into a journey brimming with purpose. Sophie stood in the kitchen, fixing a light meal for Richard. At 30, she carried the calm poise of a psychologist, but her hands moved with the same quick grace as when she'd saved his charred dinner at 10. "Eat some porridge, Uncle," she said, setting a steaming bowl before him. "I added herbs from the garden. You like those?" Richard smiled, his voice raspy but warm. "Thanks, Sophie. You always know how to cheer me up." He took the spoon, savoring each slow bite as the warmth spread through him. He glanced at Sophie, then at the others. Ella sketching at the table, Carol buried in a medical textbook, Lily arranging flower pots, and Bella chattering about a dog she'd rescued, and a simple, profound joy filled his chest. Richard's recovery wasn't easy. Those first weeks home, he spent most of his time resting, his body so weak that every step felt like a mountain. But his girls never left him alone. Sophie managed his medication schedule, patiently nudging him every hour. Carol, with her medical savvy, checked his pulse and blood pressure daily, her careful eyes softened by care. Ella brought vibrant drawings, hanging them around the house to make him laugh. Lily and Bella took turns at his side, sharing stories and singing the lullabies he had once crooned to lull them to sleep. One afternoon, as Richard sat on the porch, Victor ambled up, carrying a small wooden chair he'd fixed. "Made this for you," he grunted, his voice rough but lacking its old edge. "Sit out here for some air, but don't overdo it." Richard grinned, gesturing for Victor to join him. "Thanks, Victor. You've helped me more than you know. Not just with the house, but with me." Victor nodded, a shadow of sadness in his eyes. "You and those kids remind me of the family I once had. I didn't want to see you lose them, Richard." They sat in silence, gazing at the garden where Bella played with a little dog she'd brought from the shelter. Victor spoke again. "You know, family doesn't have to be blood. It's what you build, what you sacrifice. You've done that." Richard's eyes stung as he nodded. "I never thought I'd have a family like this. But these girls, they've given me everything." He recalled the night he pulled them from the flames, the scorched note from their mother, and realized that choosing to take them in hadn't just changed their lives, it had saved his. One day, Sophie stormed in with a thick stack of papers, her face alight with resolve. "Uncle Richard," she said firmly, "I've got proof on Harold Grayson. He deliberately cut safety costs, causing the fire." I've got enough to sue him. Richard sat up, his heart pounding. You're sure, Sophie? She nodded, handing him the files. I've been working with a lawyer. We'll take him to court. He's got to pay for what he did to Mom and Dad. The others gathered around, eyes sparking with determination. Ella grabbed Sophie's hand. We'll do it together, right? Richard looked at them, a surge of strength rising in his fragile frame. All right, we'll fight. I'll be here with you. He knew this wasn't just about justice. It was a way for his girls to close a painful chapter. One evening, as Richard grew stronger, the family decided to hold a small ceremony to honor the girls' parents and Emily. They drove to the empty lot where the apartment once stood, now just a wild patch of grass. Sophie brought 5 paper lanterns, each one symbolizing a soul they'd lost. We'll release them to the sky, she said, her voice thick, so Mum, Dad, and Emily know we're okay. Richard stood among his daughters, his trembling hands holding the lantern for Emily. He whispered, Emily, you see, I kept my promise. Bella lit the first lantern, followed by Lily, Carol, Ella, and Sophie. The 5 lights drifted upward, their golden glow twinkling against the night sky like guiding stars. As the last lantern faded, Bella wrapped her arms around Richard, her voice steady. Family isn't where you're born. It's where you choose to love. You chose us, Uncle, and we chose you. Richard hugged her tight, tears streaming down his weathered face. He looked at his girls, feeling a bond that transcended all boundaries. That night, back home, Richard sat by the fireplace, holding Emily's tattered doll that Bella had kept all these years. A faint laugh echoed in the breeze, like Emily's voice from afar. You did great, Richard. He smiled, closing his eyes, knowing that his journey, though fraught with trials, had built a family forever. But the story isn't over. Harold Grayson still lurks out there, and a legal battle looms ahead. Richard took Sophie's hand as she stepped in, her gaze unwavering. We'll face it together, right? Sophie nodded. Together, Uncle Richard, always. Hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss a single twist in this journey. Give us a like if this family reunion moved you, and drop a comment below. What do you think Harold's reckoning will be? Or just share how Richard's story has touched you. Every like, comment, and share fuels me to keep this tale alive. Together, let's see how Richard's family faces their final challenge. Catch you in the next part. Don't forget to turn on notifications.